He stood with his wine glass raised like he was about to declare war. Head tilted back, teeth bared in what most people mistook for a smile, and eyes glinting with that same icy contempt I had memorized since childhood. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be a celebration, a gathering of two families becoming one, of laughter echoing through the hall like music. But to my father, every room was a battlefield, every microphone a weapon. And every word he uttered, a bullet aimed at something soft. I don't remember exactly what dish was being served. Some over-garnished roast chicken, I think. What I do remember, with crystal clarity, was the way the air changed when he stood. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations muted. I braced myself like I had done 100 times before. Back straight, shoulders set, chin slightly lifted. The way they teach you at basic when you know an IED might be buried somewhere under your feet. But you keep walking anyway. My daughter, he began, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder like he owned it. My guts brave one. My soldier girl, or as I used to call her growing up, my fat little tank. There was laughter. Not the kind that erupts naturally, but the awkward social kind. The kind people give to bad jokes when they don't know if the speaker is serious or just drunk. He took a sip of wine and added, "She may not have gotten her mother's beauty, but at least she got some stamina, right?" He laughed at his own words, like he always did. That guttural, smug chuckle that made me want to disappear and scream at the same time. I smiled. Not wide. Not forced. Just enough to keep the peace. The groom, Daniel, was sitting to my right. His jaw was tight, and his fingers twitched slightly on the tablecloth. I could feel the heat of his discomfort beside me. But he didn't speak, not yet. Because, like me, he had learned how to pick his battles. That time would come later. I excused myself to the restroom halfway through the meal. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I looked in the mirror and examined myself like a soldier assessing a wound. Mascara intact. Lip color even, chin high. What had he said? Fat, ugly, stamina, a tank. The worst part wasn't the insult. It was the way people pretended it was a compliment. That's how he always did it. He coated his disdain in pride. Bragged about me being the only daughter who could do push-ups longer than most men, while making it sound like that was all I had. Brute strength and an absence of femininity. When my brother David graduated law school, he was introduced as the golden boy. When I came back from my third deployment, he told the neighbors I had finally stopped wasting time playing army. As if 3 tours in the Middle East were nothing but a phase. But tonight? Tonight stung differently, because tonight was supposed to be mine. This wedding wasn't grand by design, just 80 guests, a beachside venue, and a vow to keep things simple. I had insisted on that. No ballroom, no orchestra, no show, just those we cared about. But my mother had begged me to invite him. "He's still your father," she'd whispered. As if biology excused humiliation, and now here he was. Center stage, toasting to his disappointment. When I returned to the table, I saw that Daniel had moved slightly closer to my chair. He didn't say anything, just brushed his fingers against mine beneath the tablecloth, a gesture so small but so grounding. The rest of the night blurred by in a haze of speeches, clinking glasses, and carefully curated smiles. But that introduction? That would linger. I slept little that night. In the guest suite of my mother's house, I laid awake staring at the ceiling fan, its blades slicing through the quiet like thoughts I couldn't turn off. All the medals in my shadow box, all the ranks I had earned, none of them meant anything in that moment. Because my father still saw me as a fat child in boots too big for her body. I wondered how many daughters like me there were. Girls who wore camouflage to escape the invisibility at home. Who learned discipline not just from drill sergeants, but from the silence they had to maintain around their fathers. Girls who were told they were strong, but never told they were beautiful. The next morning, he was already on the porch, reading the newspaper like the night before hadn't happened. When I stepped outside with my coffee, he looked up briefly and nodded. "Sleep well, Tank?" I didn't reply, just sipped my coffee, eyes forward, muscles still. He never apologized. "Not once in my life." He always thought that wearing a uniform was a choice made by people who couldn't handle a real career. He'd told me that on the day I was promoted to major, said it like a joke. Laughed harder than anyone else. But something had shifted in me after the rehearsal dinner. Something cold and clear. A decision was forming, not out of rage, not out of revenge, but out of resolve. I was tired of navigating his minefields, tired of smiling through ambushes dressed as fatherly pride. I didn't know exactly what Daniel would say at the wedding. He hadn't told me. But I saw the glint in his eyes when my father had opened his mouth. I saw the way he had looked at me, not with pity, but with fury barely restrained. Whatever was coming. My father wouldn't be ready, and this time, I wouldn't shield him from the blast. I wasn't born in boots, but sometimes I wonder if my father wishes I had been. Maybe then, it would have justified the way he looked at me like I was a broken version of something he'd never asked for. There are girls who grow up with praise in their pockets, cheered on for drawing outside the lines, clapped for simply standing up straight. I grew up under inspections, chin tucked, gut in, shoulders back. You don't breathe unless it's to answer. You don't speak unless it's already right. From the moment I could understand words, I understood that silence was safer than softness. And discipline was the only form of affection my father ever handed out. He was Navy, 22 years and 3 promotions deep. And if he ever believed in tenderness, it drowned somewhere before I was born. My earliest memory of him wasn't a hug or a lullaby, but a correction. I had been playing outside with a neighbor, barefoot in the grass, mud on my shins, a stick in my hand like it was a magic wand. He came home early from a base meeting, saw me swinging the stick and laughing, and marched across the lawn like he was storming a beachhead. "You look like a wild piglet," he said. "Straighten your back. And put shoes on, for God's sake. You're not a savage." I must have been 5, maybe 6. That day, I cleaned myself up, put on a dress I didn't like, and sat on the porch reading his old copy of The Art of War, just to see if that would make him notice me. He didn't. When my brother David was born, I was 7. My mother let me hold him in the hospital, said I'd be a great big sister. My father said nothing. He just looked at David like he was the start of something he could finally be proud of. I was the trial run, the unfinished blueprint, the first pancake you throw away because the griddle wasn't hot enough. I didn't blame David. He grew up with different rules, a looser leash, smiles my father forgot how to give me, and for a while I convinced myself that if I worked harder, trained more, earned perfect grades, maybe I could claw my way back into whatever place I was supposed to fit into. By 11, I was doing calisthenics in the garage. Not because I wanted to, but because I overheard my father tell a neighbor that I could use some structure. She's getting a little soft. The word hit me like a slap, but he said it casually like a weather report. Soft. I ran every morning before school. Push-ups before dinner. I started doing sit-ups at night until I could barely breathe. At 12, I started writing motivational quotes in permanent marker on the inside of my closet door. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Earn your place, cry later. I never showed them to anyone. It was my secret battlefield, my private front line. The first time I ever wore a uniform was in 8th grade, junior ROTC. It felt like armor, like permission to exist. I remember standing in front of the mirror, smoothing out the creases on my shirt, straightening the belt, checking my name tag 3 times. When I walked into the living room, hoping for a nod or a word of approval, my father looked up from his paper, scanned me from head to toe, and said, "Too short. Too bulky in the shoulders. You'll never get promoted if you don't fix your posture." He didn't even pause. Just went back to his article about naval funding, like I was static in the background. I stopped asking for compliments after that. Not because I didn't crave them, but because I realized I would starve waiting. Instead, I started tracking approval in metrics, PT scores, GPA, rifle marksmanship badges. I joined every leadership camp I could. Applied early to the academy. Got in with distinction. Every medal felt like a receipt proving I wasn't useless. But every time I mailed home a picture in dress blues, my father would send back a 1-sentence reply, "Stay sharp. No, we're proud. No, well done." just a warning. As if success was a slippery slope I couldn't be trusted to stand on for long. In college, I majored in strategic studies. I thought that maybe if I spoke the language of geopolitics and warfare, I'd finally earn his full attention. But he was more interested in my brother's mock trial team than in my field reports from overseas internship simulations. At Thanksgiving, David would get 20 minutes to talk about court strategy. I'd get 5 to explain joint command leadership, before my father redirected the conversation back to football or mortgage rates. My mother would glance at me with that quiet apology in her eyes, but she never interrupted him. She hadn't done that since the Reagan administration. I was 26 when I deployed for the first time. Iraq. Not a glamorous post, but I took it without flinching. When I called home before I left, I asked him if he had any advice. He told me to keep my head down and not embarrass the family. I almost laughed. Don't embarrass the family. As if my entire life hadn't been a quiet act of damage control for his disappointment. Over there, in the dust and heat, I found something I hadn't expected. A strange kind of peace. The chain of command made sense. Respect was earned, not inherited. My team didn't care about my weight or how I looked in a dress. They cared if I could think fast under pressure, if I could stay calm under fire. And I could. Better than most. I returned home with commendations and nightmares. One of them I could talk about. The other I learned to swallow. I came back leaner, harder. My body bore the stories my father never asked to hear. Scars on my arms, burns from a motor pool accident, a ruptured ligament that still clicks when I walk in heels. But at my welcome home dinner, he looked at me once and said, "You're still big around the waist. You need to watch that." That was all. Not "glad you're safe," not "thank you for your service," just the same old audit of my body. I was 32 when I met Daniel. He wasn't military. He was calm, thoughtful, the kind of man who asked questions and waited for the answers. He never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself to be loved. He loved me in full scale, with my calloused palms and my sharp tongue, my tactical mind and my refusal to be ornamental. I warned him about my father early on. Told him he might never approve. Daniel said he didn't need his approval. He needed mine. That was the first time I felt like maybe I could build a different kind of family. When we got engaged, my father sent a 2-line email. "Congrats. Make sure it doesn't distract you from duty." I didn't even reply. But my mother did. She begged me to let him be involved. "He'll change when he sees you walk down the aisle," she said. "He's old-fashioned, but he still cares." Deep down, I didn't believe her. But I agreed. Not because I thought she was right, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could face him without bending. That brings me back to the rehearsal dinner. To his speech. To the words he sharpened and served like appetizers. Fat little tank. The laughter that followed wasn't what broke me. It was the silence from the people who should have said something. Who should have stood. Who should have told him it wasn't funny. That silence felt like childhood all over again. And yet, I didn't break. I didn't speak. I held my ground, even when it burned. Because deep in my chest, beneath the layers of muscle and metals, there was still a little girl in muddy socks who had learned to survive not by being small, but by becoming unmovable. A tank, maybe, but not his. He thought I was still waiting for his approval. What he didn't know is that I stopped needing it the moment I stopped asking for it. And what he was about to find out, at my wedding, was that he didn't hold the power anymore. Not over the story, not over the room, and certainly not over me. The next chapter would begin with a hand squeeze, a whispered promise, and a groom who had heard every cruel word and decided that silence wouldn't protect me anymore. It would begin when Daniel stood up, and when he did, my father would finally understand what it meant to lose control of a room he thought belonged to him. Forever. The base was blistering that summer, the kind of heat that crawled into your bones and refused to leave even when the sun dipped behind the horizon. I was stationed in Al-Assad at the time, surrounded by sand and steel, my days stitched together with mission briefs, strategic deconstructions, and the hum of a war that never fully slept. It was my second deployment, and by then I had already learned to stop expecting fanfare or care packages from home. But a part of me, a part I kept locked behind protocol and rank, still hoped for something that wasn't written in code or clipped into a chain of command. Recognition, perhaps, not from a general or a CO, but from the one man who had never once said the words I had wanted to hear. Just one sentence, "I'm proud of you." But from him, that phrase was a ghost, always mentioned by others, never by the man who taught me to shoot with my shoulders square and my mouth shut. I found out from a forwarded email. A friend from high school, Jen from cross country, had stumbled across a news segment back in the States. It was a local spotlight on hometown success stories, a puff piece from the city's cable station meant to highlight rising professionals. My brother David had been featured. He had just made partner at 34, the youngest ever at his firm, according to the segment. The camera showed him in a crisp navy suit, his hair sculpted to perfection, smiling as he stood next to a plaque bearing the firm's name in gold letters. David Carter, partner, Monroe, Carter, and Ellis. Jen had sent me a grainy clip of the video with a note. "Your dad was interviewed. Kind of wild seeing him on TV." My stomach sank before I even clicked play. There he was, in his usual pressed white shirt, standing outside our family home on the porch I had once stained by accident with motor oil while cleaning a field kit. His arms were crossed, his eyes sharp and proud. "He's always been the smart one," my father said into the microphone, gesturing toward a framed photo of David from high school. Even when he was little, he'd organize his Legos by category. We always knew he was going to go far. Some kids run around in the dirt. David read legal dictionaries at 12. The reporter chuckled. "A family of high achievers, it seems." My father nodded, chin high. "Yes, well, my daughter's overseas, military, doing her thing. But David, he's built something lasting. Real legacy work, and that was it. Not my name. Not my rank. Not even a passing note on my deployments. Just doing her thing, like I was scrapbooking in the desert or playing pretend with fatigues on." I remember sitting in the dimly lit Intel trailer, the video looping on my cracked laptop, and feeling something in me go still. Not break, it had already broken, years ago. But still. Like a switch flipped to permanent off. I was covered in dust and exhaustion, 12 hours into a day that had started with coordinating recon routes and ended with identifying IED signatures from drone footage. And my own father had reduced me to a footnote. Worse than that, a filler phrase between bragging rights. I didn't respond to Jen. I closed the laptop, put it away, and went outside to smoke a cigarette I didn't even want. I had quit a year before, but that night I needed something to burn besides my dignity. I leaned against the concrete blast wall and watched the horizon blur into a reddish smear. Somewhere out there, the world was still spinning for people like David, people who got dinners and applause and spotlights for signing contracts in air-conditioned rooms. Meanwhile, I was tracking insurgent movements on a shaky network and sleeping in a cot 2 feet too short. And yet I knew, even then, that I wouldn't trade places with him. I didn't want his suits or his title or even his praise. I just wanted my father to stop pretending I wasn't real. The next call I got from home was about the family reunion. My mother's voice came through the satellite line, warped and fuzzy, but I could still hear the tension beneath her careful words. "David's bringing his new girlfriend," she said, as if it were relevant. Then she added, "Your father was hoping you'd send a video message." Something short. "He thinks it'd be nice if you checked in." I asked if he was going to mention me this time. She didn't answer right away. "You know how he is," she said finally. I did. I knew exactly how he was. I sent the video anyway. 30 seconds long, uniform pressed, ribbons displayed, back straight. I kept it sterile. No jokes, no stories, no warmth. Just a scripted, clean, "Hello from Al-Assad. All's well, stay safe, love you." I wore my rank like a wall. And when they played it, as my mother later told me, my father didn't clap. He just said, "She always was good at following orders." When I came home a year later, The plaque from David's firm was hanging in our family hallway. It had replaced the photo of me in dress blues. That one was now in a box in the garage. I found it wedged between an old globe and a dusty set of encyclopedias, the frame chipped at the corner where it had been dropped. I took it without asking. It hangs in my own home now, not because I'm sentimental, but because it's a reminder of what I earned, of what I survived. David and I never really fought about it. He wasn't cruel, just indifferent. We were raised in parallel tracks, his with affection, mine with expectations. He didn't understand what it meant to be invisible, and didn't see how often I had to carve my name into the walls just to be remembered. At family dinners, he'd lead the conversations, and I'd listen. Even when I spoke, people turned toward him, waiting for his commentary to validate mine. He was the favorite, not by accident but by design. My father saw him as the continuation of his legacy. I was the deviation. And yet, when Daniel proposed to me, when he knelt by that lake in Vermont, holding a simple ring and asking if I'd let him be my calm, David was the first person I called. I don't know why. Maybe I needed someone from the family to witness that joy. Maybe I thought he'd understand what it meant for me to finally be seen, not just respected, but chosen. He said congratulations in that clean, lawyerly voice of his and added, "Let me know if you want help with any prenups." Practical, polite, distant. The wedding planning began with slow steps. My mother offered to help. Daniel's parents were kind and generous and wanted us to do things our way. But when it came time to finalize the guest list, my mother brought up my father again. "He's proud of you," she insisted. "He just doesn't know how to say it." I almost laughed. "He's proud of David," I said. "He tolerates me." She winced but didn't deny it. Still, I gave in. I let him come. I even invited David to give a speech, though I half expected him to decline. But he accepted. I wondered what he'd say, if he'd mention the law firm again, if he'd lean on his usual talking points. What I didn't expect was the way he'd look at Daniel during the rehearsal dinner. A flicker of curiosity, then something like quiet respect. Maybe he saw something in Daniel that reminded him of things I had never said out loud. But the night wasn't about Daniel. It was about my father. Always had been. And when he stood to toast me with a backhanded compliment wrapped in cruelty, no one interrupted. Not David, not even Daniel, not yet, because we were all still playing our parts, still hoping the script would change. It wouldn't, because my father didn't believe I was worthy of admiration. He believed I was strong, yes, useful perhaps, but not exceptional. Not the kind of daughter who earned headlines or accolades he understood. He didn't see the leadership, the endurance, the lives I helped save. He saw a girl who didn't look like his wife, didn't sound like a debutante, didn't shrink when criticized. And in his world, that meant I was lacking. But something had changed in me since that video clip in Al-Assad. Since the dusty evenings and sleepless nights spent watching men fall apart and putting myself back together silently. I had stopped needing to be someone else's story. I had stopped apologizing for my volume. For my body, for my survival, what was coming would not be a spectacle. It would not be a scream or a slap or a storm. It would be measured, surgical, like a well-planned strike that no one sees coming until the building's already on fire. And when the flames reached him, he'd be holding the wine glass himself. The night I told my parents I was engaged, I had no expectations of applause. I didn't imagine my father lifting his glass or even cracking the smallest of smiles. I knew better. By then, I had stopped looking for approval in places where silence had always lived. Still, when I made the call, I paused before dialing, stared at the screen for a moment longer than I needed to, and inhaled like I was about to deliver bad news. Not share something I had once dreamed of as a girl, too quiet for attention and too sturdy to be delicate. My mother answered. I could hear her folding something in the background. Laundry, maybe, or one of her routines meant to keep her hands busy while her words were forced into warmth. She greeted me with surprise, and that thin breath she always took before passing the phone to my father without asking if I wanted to speak to him. But this time I stopped her. Tell him to stay on the line, I said. I have news. There was a shuffle, a pause, and then his voice, blunt, flat, just as I remembered it. Go ahead, I told them about Daniel. About the proposal. I kept it brief, clean, no flowery language, no emotion leaking through, just facts. A lakeside weekend, a simple question, and a yes. My mother gasped in delight. My father exhaled through his nose like he was disappointed in how anticlimactic it all sounded. And what does he do? He asked, already bored. Civilian? Yes, I said. Aerospace engineer, a pause. Not interest, not even politeness, just the absence of movement. And his name? I said it clearly without hesitation. Daniel Albrecht. It was like dropping a match into a dry field. The silence after that name wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged. My father's breath hitched just enough to make me sit up straighter. Albrecht? He repeated slower this time. As in, Walter Albrecht? I didn't answer right away. I let the weight of the question hang. Yes, Daniel's his son. Another silence. Then my mother's voice, quieter now, like she had just remembered something sacred. You never told us that. You never asked, I said. And it was true. They had asked nothing. Not how we met. Not what I loved about him. Not where we planned to live. Just job titles and bloodlines, because that was all they had ever valued. Walter Albrecht wasn't a stranger to my father. They had served together briefly, years ago. Different branches, different command styles, but the same war. My father had spoken of him only once, during a rare conversation in which he allowed vulnerability to leak through his stonework. He had described Walter as the kind of officer who didn't need to raise his voice to be respected, and for my father, that had been the highest possible praise. It was the only time I had heard him speak of another man with something like admiration. I never forgot it. So when I met Daniel, and he told me his full name, the irony wasn't lost on me. I had fallen for the son of a man my father had once tried to impress. After the call, everything changed. But not in the way I had hoped. My father didn't become warmer. He didn't offer congratulations. He became strategic. Cold, curious, calculating. I received emails from him for the first time in months. Short, clipped messages asking about the guest list, the venue, who would be invited from Walter's side, whether his old commanding officer might attend. He never mentioned Daniel directly, only your fiancé, as if naming him gave too much ground. My mother, in contrast, became giddy. She started calling more often, offering to help with dress shopping, flower arrangements, guest coordination, things she had never shown interest in before. But I knew the truth. They weren't excited for me. They were excited by association. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was connected. Not through merit, but through name. And that revelation stung more than any insult my father had ever thrown my way. When I brought Daniel to meet them in person, my father greeted him with the stiff posture of a man meeting a dignitary, not a future son-in-law. He asked questions about Walter, not about Daniel. How's your father? Still consulting for the Pentagon? Daniel, ever polite, nodded and answered graciously. But later in the car, he turned to me and said, I don't think he knows anything about me that doesn't come with your last name attached. He doesn't, I said. And he never will. I kept waiting for the moment when the reality of our engagement would outweigh the optics, when my father would acknowledge me, not as an extension of a man he respected, but as his daughter, a woman he had ignored, belittled, and overlooked for most of her life. That moment never came. Instead, he started to assert himself in small, patronizing ways. He offered to coach Daniel through the rehearsal process, said he could help with speeches, tone, military bearing. I watched Daniel bite back 1,000 responses, choosing peace over pettiness, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. He was starting to understand what I had endured. In one particularly grating moment, my father asked if I had considered keeping my last name out of respect for family continuity. I laughed. Short, sharp, involuntary. You mean your name? I asked. Yes, he said without irony. The Carter name carries weight. I thought of all the nights I had spent cleaning rifles alone, all the medals I had earned without a single mention in the family Christmas letter, all the ways I had carried his name like a burden instead of a banner. It does, I agreed. But not the kind you think. The wedding planning progressed with slow tension. Daniel and I kept things simple. A ceremony by the water, limited guests, minimal pageantry. But my father found ways to insert himself. He wanted to give a toast. He asked for a special moment in the program. Just a few words, he insisted. My mother begged me to allow it. It's important to him, she said. He wants to show people you're still close. I almost laughed again. We were never close, I said. He just wants to control the narrative. Daniel supported whatever I chose. If you let him speak, you know what he'll say, he warned gently. But if you don't, he'll make you the villain. He already has, I said. 1,000 times. Still, I relented. I told him he could speak, not because I wanted him to, but because I knew I had to let him dig his own grave in public. And deep down, I knew Daniel had a plan. I had seen it forming behind his quiet expressions. Something was building. A line, a gesture, a reckoning. He hadn't told me what, and I hadn't asked. We were both soldiers in our own ways, and we understood the power of timing. The night before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner, I watched my father circle the room like a general surveying his troops. He shook hands with old colleagues, introduced himself with rank and bravado, made comments about Daniel's posture and handshake. He toasted to the union of two strong families and said something about bloodlines built on service and tradition. Then he turned to me, wine in hand, and said, "And to my daughter, the strong one, the reliable one, the one who always got up when she was knocked down. Not the prettiest, maybe, but solid. Built like a tank." Laughter. Again. The same cruel note, the same smug grin. This time, Daniel squeezed my hand beneath the table and didn't let go. My father had no idea what was coming. He thought he had won the room, that he had framed the story to his advantage. He didn't see the way eyes darted toward me, not with pity, but with unease. They saw the cracks now, the undercurrent, the disrespect woven into his charm. And Daniel? He was calm, unshaken. He had waited, measured, calculated. And tomorrow, at the ceremony, when it was his turn to speak, he would not let it pass. My father loved legacy. He loved lineage and rank and the illusion of control. But what he never understood was that the real legacy we leave behind isn't forged in titles or affiliations. It's etched in the way we treat the people closest to us when no one else is watching. And he had failed that test every time. What was coming wasn't vengeance. It wasn't revenge. It was truth. Delivered clean, surgical, with the elegance of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect. And when the truth arrived, it would not ask for permission. The morning of my wedding, I woke up before the sun. Not from nerves, not from excitement, but from habit. Years of military wake-up calls had trained my body to anticipate the hour when the world was still quiet, when light hadn't yet pressed through the blinds, when thoughts moved slowly enough to be heard. I sat up in the small guest suite of the inn we had rented near the shoreline, feet touching the cool wood floor, the air smelling faintly of ocean salt and faded linen. The wedding was scheduled for late afternoon, just as the sun would begin dipping toward the water, casting everything in gold. It was meant to be simple, intimate, controlled, but nothing about the hours ahead felt peaceful. My dress hung near the window, long, clean, elegant. No beads, no sequins, nothing that sparkled too loud. Just smooth fabric, cut with the same precision I brought to everything I did. There were no bridesmaids scurrying around with curling irons. No chaotic glam squad. Just me, my quiet, and a mug of black coffee. I had chosen this path deliberately, to strip away the noise, the fanfare, the illusions of tradition. I had no need for someone to give me away, no desire for performances of fatherly pride that had never existed in reality. So I made it clear from the beginning I would walk alone. My mother hadn't argued. She knew better. But my father? His silence said more than any protest could have. When the invitation arrived, printed in crisp black ink, he called my mother into his office, closed the door, and stayed there for hours. He didn't respond. Not formally. Not even with a courtesy call. He simply said through my mother that he would attend but not participate, and I accepted that. I thought it would be enough. His absence from the aisle would be a quiet acknowledgement of the truth, that he had never earned the role, never held the place he believed was his by default. But what I didn't anticipate was how he would find another way to insert himself. Because men like him don't fade. They shift. They adapt. And when the spotlight won't turn toward them naturally, they build their own stage. The ceremony was held at a quiet cove where the trees leaned in close to the water, and the breeze carried everything it touched like a secret. Daniel waited beneath a white arch we had built ourselves, wrapped in pale fabric and eucalyptus. The guests were already seated, the music just starting its gentle progression. I stood at the edge of the path, dress settled around me like armor, heart steady, steps calculated, not from anxiety, but from the weight of knowing that this moment, this walk, would never be replicated. I didn't need an arm to hold. I didn't need a symbol to validate the life I had built with my own 2 hands. I took the first step and felt nothing but the earth beneath me and the gaze of those who mattered. The ceremony unfolded exactly as we planned. Vows were exchanged with eyes locked, not voices trembling. The officiant spoke of commitment, of choice, of the courage it takes to build something when the world teaches you only how to survive. And then, as we turned to face our guests, ready to be announced as husband and wife, the unexpected happened. My father stood up. From his seat, near the back row, a position he had chosen deliberately, just far enough to be above it all and just close enough to be seen, he rose. He was dressed in his full formal uniform. Not a tuxedo, not a suit, but the navy whites, pressed to perfection, medals lined in sharp rows across his chest, as if he had earned the right to wear them today. My breath caught, not from fear, from fury held still behind my teeth. "I wasn't asked to speak," he began, turning slowly to address the crowd. But some things deserve to be said regardless of invitation. A few guests turned to look at me, unsure if this was planned. It wasn't. Daniel's hand tightened around mine, his jaw locked, but he didn't move. Neither did I. My father continued. "Today, my daughter is getting married. And though I was not asked to walk her down the aisle, I still feel the need to say a few words about the woman she has become." I wanted to walk away. I wanted to take Daniel's hand and disappear into the woods until the sound of my father's voice was nothing more than wind. But I stood there, frozen, watching a man perform a monologue written for an audience he never truly knew. "She's always been strong," he said, pausing like he couldn't find the right adjective that didn't insult me. "Tough. She was the kind of girl who never cried when she fell. Always got back up. She was built like a soldier before she ever wore the uniform. And maybe, that made it hard for me to see her as anything else." He laughed, low and forced. "I used to call her Tank when she was a kid. Meant it as a compliment. She could bulldoze anything, doors, expectations, even people. And now here she is, standing at the altar, proving everyone wrong, as if the only people who ever doubted me lived in his head. As if his ridicule hadn't been the loudest voice I carried for years. My skin burned. My fists clenched. I knew what this was. Not a tribute. Not a confession. A branding. A final attempt to tie his name to something he had tried his entire life to untether from himself. He concluded with a smug nod. "To the groom, you've got your hands full. But you've also got someone who will never quit. Because she never quit on herself." A few people clapped out of politeness or confusion. The officiant looked at me, unsure whether to resume or retreat. Daniel's thumb traced a single circle on the back of my hand, grounding me. "Let's continue," I said quietly. And so we did. The ceremony closed with gentle applause, hugs, photos, and quiet congratulations. But beneath it all, there was a tremor, a current. A question unspoken but present in every guest's eyes. Why did he do that? The answer was simple. Because he could. Because he needed the room to remember him. Because my silence had always been his cue to keep talking. Later, at the reception, he approached me. Alone. No audience. No camera. Just him, standing near the edge of the dance floor while Daniel spoke with relatives, and the music played something soft in the background. You looked fine, he said. Dress suits you. Not what I expected, but fine. I didn't respond. He shifted. I know you didn't want me to say anything, but I had to. I couldn't just sit there like some placeholder. I finally looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had watched me grow into someone he refused to see, who had spent decades crafting me into a shadow of what he thought strength looked like, and still never learned to accept the shape I took. You couldn't sit there, I said, because sitting still has never been your strength. He frowned. You think I did something wrong? I think you never learned the difference between presence and performance. He exhaled, sharp. You always were dramatic. No, I said. I was always quiet. You mistook silence for absence, but today I learned that some silences are louder than speeches. He didn't reply. He looked at me like I was a puzzle missing the piece he had lost a long time ago. And then he walked away, straight-backed and stiff, as if he had saluted a ghost and found it still standing. That night, after the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Daniel and I sat alone on the edge of the dance floor, shoes off, hands entwined, the remains of the evening curling around us like the end of a long operation. He turned to me and whispered, Tomorrow I'll say what he couldn't. I nodded. I know. And I believed him, because what came next would not be about revenge. It would be about truth. Delivered not as a weapon but as a shield, for me. For all the parts of me that had been ignored, dismissed, and rewritten. And when Daniel stood the next day to give his speech, it wouldn't be for my father. It would be for the girl he tried to erase. The next morning, I watched my mother cry from across the breakfast table. Not loudly, not in a way that drew attention, but with the quiet collapse of someone who'd trained her whole life to hold in every emotion until it grew heavy enough to warp the spine. She didn't sob or wipe her face dramatically. She just sat there, holding the same mug of tea she'd been drinking since I was a child, her eyes glossed over as if she was staring at a place only she could see. There were no words between us, only the slow movements of routine, the clink of ceramic, the creak of the wooden chair under her thin frame, the distant sound of Daniel walking down the hallway, preparing for the speech he had promised me he'd give. I watched her from the corner of my eye, the same way I used to when I was younger, waiting for signs of comfort or approval that never came in sentences, only in softened gazes and hands that lingered a little longer when brushing my hair back behind my ears. My mother was never cruel. She was quiet. Her love was the kind you had to translate. And I had grown fluent in her silence. I hadn't expected her to cry. Not after everything. Not after decades of bearing witness to my father's sharp words, his dismissals, his strategic affection that came only when it made him look good. But I realized, as I watched her sit there unmoving, that the tears weren't about me. They were for her. For the parts of herself she had buried under his shadow. For the daughter she couldn't protect. For the shame she'd swallowed every time she looked away when I was humiliated and told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. Her grief wasn't for what had been said the night before. It was for what she hadn't said in time. She hadn't spoken to me after the speech. Not during the dancing, not during the farewells. She'd kissed my cheek once, held my hand for a moment too long, and then turned toward my father like a soldier being dismissed. I wondered if she'd say anything this morning, if she'd apologize or explain or find some fragile excuse to justify the man who'd stood in full uniform to remind everyone he had a daughter strong enough to be tolerated. But she said nothing, just stared into the steam rising from her cup. I adjusted my medals. I had left them on the small table near the window, not out of vanity, but because I didn't want them boxed away on my wedding day like a part of me that didn't belong in that world. I wore them not for spectacle, but for balance. They grounded me. They reminded me who I was before I became the version of myself he tried to control. I picked up each one with care, checking the pins, the polish, the placement. They weren't symbols of war to me. They were pieces of language, chapters of a story I had written in sweat and strategy. And that morning, as I fastened them onto the jacket I'd wear over my dress for the post-ceremony brunch, I saw my mother glance at them and blink more rapidly than before. She whispered something then, so faint I almost missed it. "You looked beautiful yesterday." I turned to her, waiting to see if there was more, but she just looked down at her cup and added, "I should have said that sooner." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, that we were both products of the same silent war that shaped women to survive, not to speak. But I couldn't force the words. Not yet. I simply nodded. She rose from the table, set her cup in the sink without rinsing it, and left the kitchen like she had somewhere urgent to be, even though we both knew she didn't. Her absence lingered. Daniel met me outside by the garden path that led toward the banquet hall where the brunch was being held. His hand slipped into mine naturally, like it belonged there. He looked at the medals, then at my face, and gave a quiet nod. "You ready?" I nodded. "Are you?" He smiled faintly. "More than he is." The guests were already gathering when we arrived. Most wore sunglasses, hangovers tucked behind polite smiles. The aftermath of weddings always felt surreal to me, like waking up from a dream you didn't realize was unsettling until you tried to remember it. My father was already seated near the front, posture rigid, hands folded on the table like he was at a debrief. My mother sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, eyes scanning the garden like she was hoping to disappear into it. Daniel stood when the coordinator called for the first toast. His movements were calm, deliberate. No notes, no index cards, just the quiet authority of a man who knew his voice mattered. The room silenced as he stepped forward, champagne glass in hand, sunlight catching the gold band on his ring finger. I watched my father's jaw tighten, his fingers twitch. He knew this was coming. He just didn't know how. Daniel didn't speak immediately. He let the silence settle. He looked around the room slowly, meeting eyes, not commanding them, but holding them. And then he began. "I was told not to speak today," he said, voice steady. Told that the wedding ceremony was enough, that words had already been shared. But I disagree, because there's something that needs to be said. And it's not about flowers or cake or family legacies. It's about the woman I married. He turned to look at me, not for effect, but with that same steady gaze he'd always given me when I started to unravel. She has been called many things in her life. Strong, tough, unyielding, built like a tank. A ripple of awkward laughter passed through a few guests, but he didn't smile. But here's what I see. I see a woman who has led troops into chaos and returned with every soldier accounted for. I see someone who carries more honor in her silence than most people carry in their speeches. I see a woman who has been overlooked, underestimated, and spoken over, and who still stands taller than any pedestal someone else might build for her. He paused. Let it breathe. Some people mistake strength for masculinity. They think that power has to look a certain way, that beauty fits in a box, that dignity must be delivered with softness. But she proves them wrong. Every day, she is not strong despite being a woman. She is strong because she is one. He shifted his glass slightly, lowered his tone. To the people who raised her, I know she didn't get the praise she deserved. I know she was told to stay in line, to toughen up, to not expect affection where duty stood in its place. But I want you to know something. She was already whole before she met me. She didn't need saving. She didn't need softening. She needed one thing. To be seen, the room had gone silent. Even the breeze seemed to pause. I see her. Every inch. Every metal. Every scar. Every part of her that someone once tried to trim down to be more palatable. I see her. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure she knows it. He raised his glass. To the woman who never needed permission to be powerful. There was no applause at first. Just stillness. Then a few claps. Then more. But I didn't hear them. I only heard the sound of my mother breathing out, an audible exhale as if she had been holding it in for decades. I turned slightly, saw her eyes wet again. but not with grief. Not this time. It was something else, something lighter. She met my gaze and nodded once, not in apology, not in regret, but in acknowledgement. For the first time, I believed she saw me. My father didn't clap. He didn't move. He sat there, jaw clenched, hands white-knuckled against the edges of his glass. He didn't make a scene. He didn't challenge the speech. He simply stayed still, the way men do when they realize they no longer own the narrative. Later, as guests milled around, as sunlight deepened into amber and conversations softened into farewells, he approached me one last time. No smile, no pride, just words he had rehearsed. That speech was calculated. I looked at him. No, that speech was earned. He blinked. Then, with no response, he turned and walked away. My mother lingered. She touched my arm briefly and said, "You didn't just get married yesterday. You took your place." And for the first time I smiled, not out of defense, not out of deflection, but because I knew she was right. I adjusted my medals one last time that evening as Daniel and I packed the final boxes into the car. They shone in the fading light, not as decoration, but as confirmation. He had tried to define me with his silence. Daniel had redefined me with his voice. But I had built myself with both. I didn't flinch when the guests laughed. I didn't blink when the word tank hit the air again, this time laced with a smugness only he could deliver. My father stood like he always did, shoulders back, chest puffed, tone dressed in polished arrogance, and made his toast in front of 80 people like it was just another inspection. Just another parade where he was the only one in step. His voice cut through the ambient clinking of glasses and silverware, and his smile was the same one I had seen for years, tight, rehearsed, hollow. "She was never one for frills," he said, looking down at his wine with that theatrical pause he loved so much. "But I always said she was built for durability, built like a tank." A few chuckles, one loud laugh from the back that cracked too long, then fizzled into silence. That was all it took. A single sentence to fold an entire lifetime of effort back into a caricature, a punchline. My hand was on the table, fingers curled slightly inward, resting near my place setting, pretending to be indifferent. I had trained for this, more than for any deployment, any board, any rank ceremony. I had rehearsed my face into steel, learned the exact micro-movements that kept rage from rising too visibly through the neck, the precise way to breathe without letting it show in your shoulders. But none of that stopped the heat that bloomed in my chest, the weight that settled against my spine like someone had tied lead to my posture. I wasn't angry. I was tired. And that was worse. I was tired of hearing my name reduced to shapes that didn't fit, of being molded in conversations where I had no voice, of being spoken about but never to. The applause that followed was tepid, polite, obligated. I smiled just enough. That familiar, measured smile I'd learned from my mother, the kind women wear when it's too late to leave but too early to fight. My eyes didn't meet his. They drifted down instead, landing softly on the hand that slid beneath the table and wrapped around mine with quiet, deliberate pressure. Daniel's grip wasn't tight. It didn't tremble. It wasn't performative. It was real, warm, steady, present. His thumb moved once, just once, across the back of my hand. That was all it took. A gesture small enough to miss, but deep enough to anchor. Then he leaned closer, so subtly no one noticed, and whispered, "I know what to do." He didn't say it like a threat. He didn't say it like a promise either. He said it like a man who had finally reached the edge of restraint and found clarity waiting there. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. And I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't look at him or squeeze his hand in response. I just kept my eyes on my plate and let his words settle into me like armor I didn't have to forge alone. The rest of the dinner played out like a script I had already read. Conversations rose and fell, plates were cleared, drinks refilled, and people began circling around the safe topics: the weather, the wine, the travel plans. But beneath it all was a hum, a tension so soft you could only hear it if you'd been listening for it your whole life. My father had drawn attention, as he always did, and now everyone danced around the weight of his words. Some guests smiled at me too brightly. Others avoided my gaze altogether. I heard one woman, an aunt from Daniel's side, mutter, "That was bold," as she walked past our table. I smiled. I had other words in mind. That night, in the quiet of our shared room, I undressed slowly, peeling away the outer layers of fabric and frustration. Daniel stood by the window, still in his formal shirt, sleeves rolled up, collar open. He didn't speak. He just watched me with the kind of focus that made everything else in the world dissolve. When I finally sat down beside him on the edge of the bed, he turned and said, "He doesn't see you." I nodded. "He never has." "Then tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to make sure everyone else does." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I knew Daniel. I knew how he moved through the world, quiet, composed, rarely shaken. But I also knew that when he chose to speak, he could level a room with nothing but his voice. He wasn't loud. He was deliberate. And people listened. The morning of the brunch, I dressed with more intention than I had the day before. Not out of vanity, but out of defiance. I chose the uniform jacket, the medals, the sharp lines of my rank. Not to compete with my father's presence, but to reclaim mine. I wasn't a bride anymore. I was a soldier who had endured, who had outlasted, who had earned her seat at every table where she'd been ignored. And today, I would sit in that chair, spine straight, while Daniel spoke truths that had lived in silence far too long. The garden was radiant that morning, the air crisp, the light soft. Guests gathered beneath white awnings, sipping coffee and murmuring their expectations for a simple brunch send-off. My father stood again near the front, in a less formal suit this time, but still radiating authority like it was a cologne he'd never stopped wearing. My mother sat beside him, hands in her lap, expression unreadable. When Daniel stood, everything shifted. He didn't rush. He walked slowly to the small podium they'd set up near the floral arch, paused and looked out across the tables. He began, not with a joke or a cliché, but with a statement. There are two versions of every person, the one the world sees and the one they never ask about. The air stilled. Forks were set down. Glasses forgotten mid-sip. "I married a woman yesterday who has lived too long inside the second version," he continued. "A woman who has earned medals for bravery, led missions most people wouldn't survive, carried burdens heavier than any father's expectations, and returned not bitter but wiser." I saw my father shift in his seat, the muscle in his jaw tightening. She was called a tank. That was meant to be an insult. But let me tell you what I see when I look at her. I see armor, yes, but not because she's hardened. Because she's been attacked more times than I can count and still chose to protect others instead of retreat. I see strength, not the kind that bruises, but the kind that bends so others can rest. I see beauty, not the fragile kind, not the curated kind, but the beauty of presence, of integrity, of someone who stands even when she's alone. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just listened. To those who raised her, I say this: you built someone remarkable. But you forgot to tell her. And that silence over time becomes noise. It becomes the voice she hears even when you're not speaking. So I will. He turned toward me and for the first time addressed me directly. "I see you. I love every part of you. The parts the world claps for and the parts it tries to edit. I married you not to soften you, not to change you, but to join you. And I promise, for as long as I breathe, no one will ever speak over you again, not even in a whisper." He raised his glass. "To the one who commands without raising her voice, who leads without demanding praise, and who deserves every damn ounce of respect she was denied. To my wife." The applause didn't erupt. It emerged, quiet, then fuller, like something rising from the floorboards. My mother clapped first, slowly but with purpose. Then others joined, one by one, and when it swelled to full volume, I finally allowed myself to feel it. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look triumphant. He looked steady, certain, proud, not for himself, but for me. Across the garden, my father sat motionless. His hand was still on his glass, the wine untouched. His face was unreadable, but his silence, this time, wasn't power. It was defeat, and it was earned. There's a strange kind of stillness that wraps itself around the moment right before something shifts for good. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's just a subtle rearrangement of air, of pressure, of presence. The sound of people laughing without knowing what they're laughing at. The sound of cutlery against porcelain. The way your own lungs feel like they've forgotten how to exhale naturally. That's what I remember most from the brunch, more than the sunlight or the speeches or the smell of flowers wilting slightly in the heat. I remember counting my breaths while the guests chuckled politely at things they didn't understand, at jokes they hadn't fully heard, at words delivered with enough confidence to hide the cruelty tucked inside them. I remember scanning the perimeter of my own wedding celebration like it was a hostile environment, not because I was scared, but because I had been trained to anticipate threats long before they announced themselves. I knew what was coming, not the details but the shape of it. And he didn't. That made all the difference. Daniel's toast had landed like a quiet explosion, elegant, strategic, final. No theatrics, no retaliation, just truth laid bare like a map, and an invitation for anyone listening to choose whether they would follow or pretend they were never handed the coordinates. Most did what people do when faced with discomfort. They clapped, they smiled, they moved on. My mother had cried. My father had frozen. And I? I had survived. Again, not with fire. Not with fury. Just by remaining. Just by not leaving the room. But the story didn't end there. Men like my father don't surrender. They wait. They find new angles. And when the brunch ended and the tables were cleared and the guests began to thin out, I knew he'd make one more move. Not because he wanted to reconcile, but because he couldn't stomach the idea of silence lasting longer than his influence. He had to speak. He had to reclaim the room. He had to remind everyone that no matter what was said about him, he was still standing, still watching, still wearing the uniform in his mind, even if the medals had rusted and the audience had begun to shrink. He cornered Daniel first. Not me, not directly. He approached him near the edge of the garden, just as Daniel was helping my aunt load leftover flowers into her car. I saw it from a distance. His stance, his timing, the way he leaned in just slightly, voice low enough to be private but firm enough to carry the weight of authority. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't respond, at least not with words I could see. He simply stood taller, not in defiance but in dignity. And after a few moments, my father walked away. His expression wasn't angry. It was puzzled, as if he had spoken a language that used to work and found himself suddenly unheard. When he turned toward me, I didn't move. I didn't pretend to check my phone or look away. I watched him walk across the flagstones like I was watching the final scene of a film I'd seen 100 times, but never paid to see. He stopped just short of my space, close enough to be heard, far enough to keep plausible deniability. "You trained him well," he said. I raised one eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Your husband," he continued. "Polite, composed, knows when to hold his tongue. Impressive." I didn't answer. I just waited. "He spoke well," my father added, as if he were grading a presentation. "I can see why you married him." Still, I said nothing. Because I knew what he wanted. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a bridge back into the narrative, even if it was built from debris. "But you're wrong," he said then, lowering his voice. "You think he saw you, but he only saw the part of you you let him see, the part you built to survive me. And one day he'll see what's underneath, and then we'll see if he still stands beside you. It was a scalpel, not a blade." He had learned that over time. The sharpest insults weren't loud. They were surgical, clean, delivered with precision, not volume. But he had forgotten something. He had forgotten that I had stopped bleeding from his cuts years ago, that I had stitched every wound myself, that I had learned to carry scar tissue like armor, not shame. I stepped forward once. Just once, enough to erase the distance between us. "You think he only knows the version of me you created?" I said, voice low. No, he knows everything. The girl who ran laps until her feet blistered because her father told her she was slow. The cadet who passed out from dehydration because she was too afraid to ask for a break. The woman who came home from war and was told her brother's new office view was the real achievement of the year. He knows her. He loves her. He married her. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. He had spent his life reading people like maps, like enemies, like subordinates. But he had never learned to read me when I wasn't trying to disappear. He had only ever known how to fight me when I was retreating. He didn't know what to do when I stood still. You still think this is about approval? I said. It's not. It never was. This is about space, and you've run out of yours. He scoffed softly as if he had something else to say, but then he stopped. His lips pressed into a line, his gaze breaking for the first time as he looked past me, not at me. I didn't follow his stare. I didn't care where it landed. I turned and walked away before he could reclaim the last word, because it no longer mattered. Not to me. Not to the person I had become beyond the reach of his sentences. The rest of the guests said their goodbyes with warm hands and words that felt genuine. They hugged me with something different in their eyes, something like recognition. Not sympathy, not obligation, but respect, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. Daniel and I stood near the garden gate as the cars pulled away one by one, waving, smiling, holding each other like a quiet barricade. And when the last vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, we didn't speak for a while. We just stood there, watching the dust settle. Finally, Daniel turned to me and said, "You didn't flinch." I looked at him, unsure if it was a question or a compliment. When he tried again. When he said what he said. "You didn't flinch." I shrugged lightly. I was counting breaths. He nodded. "And now?" "Now," I said. "I'm done counting." Because the war was over. Not the one between us and my father. That would rage in echoes and whispers long after the flowers died. No, the real war, the one I had fought inside myself for years, the one that told me I wasn't enough, or that I had to prove I was finally quiet. And not because I had won, but because I had walked away. There's a kind of silence that doesn't settle. It sharpens. It doesn't comfort, it cuts. It wraps itself around your ribs not like a blanket, but like wire, coiling with every breath you try to take until the only way to stay whole is to stop breathing altogether. That was the silence that filled the room after Daniel said the words. Not the opening lines, not the charming prelude expected from a groom speaking at the reception, but the sentence that didn't come rehearsed or gentle. The sentence that opened something we had both kept protected until that exact moment, not because we were ashamed, but because some truths don't fit inside polite company or matching floral arrangements. Some truths aren't meant to be whispered behind napkins or shared in tearful confessions. Some truths deserve a stage, and Daniel gave mine one. It happened halfway through the speech, when most of the guests had already softened from champagne and small talk, when my father had begun to lean back in his chair with the smug relief of someone who believed the worst had passed, who believed he had weathered the storm and reclaimed some of the spotlight by merely remaining. Daniel had begun soft, thanking the guests, honoring our parents, even giving my mother a nod that made her eyes flicker in something between surprise and gratitude. But then his tone shifted, his posture straightened, and his eyes found my father's like a rifle finds a target, not in haste but with purpose. "There's a story most of you don't know," he said. A story I haven't told publicly, because for a long time it wasn't mine to share. The clinking stopped. Forks paused. Glasses lowered. It's about the first time I saw her cry. Not the kind of crying that begs for comfort or attention. No. The kind that happens so quietly it almost doesn't look like pain at all. The kind that unfolds like a habit, discreet, efficient, internal. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His words knew the path. It was during a storm, he continued. Not outside, but inside her. We were in her apartment, months before the engagement, before she believed I was going to stay. I had asked her a question, something simple, like where she kept a family photo. She had said, There aren't many. And I had laughed, thinking she was joking. But then I saw her walk into the hallway, open the closet, and pull out a shoebox filled not with pictures, but with letters. Letters from deployments, from commanding officers, from soldiers she had trained. Notes of gratitude, respect, some stained, some torn at the edges. But not a single one from home. I heard someone shift in their seat. I kept my eyes forward. She sat on the floor and opened one of them, Daniel said. Read it out loud like she was reading from scripture. And when she finished, she folded it so carefully, placed it back in the box, and said, "This is how I remind myself I exist." And then she smiled. Not the kind of smile that means anything. The kind that says, "This is normal." The room had gone very still. Later that night, he went on, I asked her about her father. She said, "He was proud of my brother." "I don't know what he felt about me," I asked. "Did he ever say he was proud of you?" She said no, but he gave me a nickname once. I asked what it was. She said Tank. The silence cracked then, not from the audience but from him. His voice didn't break, but it deepened, solidified. He called her Tank because she was big, strong, unyielding. What he didn't realize was that she became that way because he never gave her permission to be anything else. And the thing about tanks is, they're designed to survive where nothing else can. But they aren't meant to carry everything alone. He finally looked at me then. Not for validation, but for grounding. And I gave it to him. She doesn't need his approval. She doesn't even need his apology. What she needs is what she's always deserved, to be seen. To be spoken of in full sentences. To be remembered not for how much she could endure, but for how much she gave and gave and gave, without ever asking for anything in return. He looked back to the room, and his gaze found my father again. This time without hesitation. So I'll tell the truth he never did. I'll tell you who she is. She is not a tank. She is not a disappointment. She is not a shadow of someone else's success. She is a leader, a protector, a woman who has walked into places others flee from, and returned with more dignity than she was ever given at home. And then, without raising his voice, without stepping forward, he said the sentence that shattered whatever performance my father had been holding up like a shield. She is the reason I became a better man, and she is the reason I never needed a father figure, because I already had someone stronger than that. The air cracked then, not with applause, not with gasps, but with stillness so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. I didn't turn to look at my father. I didn't need to. I heard the shift in his breathing. The wine glass he had lifted earlier was still in his hand, but it no longer rose. It hovered, stalled, suspended in the air like he had forgotten how to complete the motion. His face had gone pale, not from embarrassment, but from something worse. Recognition. That kind of stillness doesn't come from insult. It comes from impact. From the realization that someone else had spoken your truth more clearly than you ever could. Daniel finished the speech with no fanfare. No dramatic ending. Just the toast to my wife, my partner, my mirror, my home, and the room rose to its feet, one by one, not in perfect unison, not in practiced choreography, but in a slow, rising wave of acknowledgement. Not for the groom, not even for the speech, but for the woman they had begun to understand, not because she told them who she was, but because someone had finally spoken the part of her story that had been written in silence for decades. My mother was crying. Openly this time. Not in shame, but in release, in revelation, as if someone had finally cracked a window in the house she'd been holding her breath in since she said "I do" to a man who taught her to fear the sound of her own voice. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't need to. I saw her mouth the words "thank you," and I gave her the smallest nod I could without breaking. The aftermath was slow. The kind of emotional weather that doesn't come with storms, but with steady rain. People approached me with softness in their voices, unsure of how to stand beside what they'd just heard. They offered small gestures, touches on the shoulder, gentle smiles, quiet affirmations. My father didn't approach. He sat, he stayed. his posture still straight but no longer proud. Rigid in a different way, like a man trying not to collapse from within. Later, Daniel and I stood near the far edge of the reception tent, overlooking the water. The waves were calm. The sky was turning that soft blue-gray that comes just before the first stars show up. He reached for my hand and said nothing, and I leaned into him, letting the silence be soft for once. "I didn't expect you to say that," I whispered eventually. He smiled faintly. "I didn't either, until I realized no one else would." I turned to look at him. "He won't forgive you." "I didn't ask him to," he said. I didn't say it for him. And that's when I understood what had truly happened. My father had never feared losing control. He had feared losing the story. He had built his identity out of being the one who defined everyone else. And that night, Daniel had rewritten the narrative with one truth he couldn't erase: that someone had finally seen me, not through the lens of expectation or disappointment, but in full. With clarity, with conviction, without asking for permission, and my father's face, white, stunned, still, would be the only confirmation we'd ever need. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. No glass shattered, no gasp followed. Just a quiet, involuntary pfft as the wine shot forward from between his lips, arcing downward in a single pathetic burst onto the linen tablecloth. The silence that followed was not immediate. It was delayed by milliseconds, as if the room itself had to process what had just happened. Some guests pretended not to notice. Others turned too quickly, then froze mid-motion, eyes darting between the droplets of red on the cream cloth and the man who had made the mess. But I didn't move. I didn't lean forward, didn't flinch, didn't even twitch. I had spent a lifetime preparing for this kind of moment. A controlled detonation in plain sight. A ripple too sharp to be called drama, too precise to be called revenge. I stood at the edge of the reception floor, spine lengthened by something deeper than pride, anchored by something colder than victory. I had no interest in his reaction. It was never about that. It was about the pause that followed, about that first, unmistakable moment when a man realizes the war he thought he'd already won is still going. And worse, he's no longer the one writing the strategy. He hadn't seen it coming. Of course he hadn't. Men like him never do. They train themselves to read the loudest voice in the room, to find the flashiest target, to control the chaos by standing taller and speaking sharper. But they never look for the quiet one, the still one, the woman sitting in silence at the edge of her own wedding celebration, whose entire body is already a fortress. He thought I would blink, thought I would apologize with a laugh, or wave it off with a gentle deflection, that I would give him something he could use to climb back into the story. But I didn't, because that seat was no longer his. Because he had finally arrived at the edge of the stage, and the lights had shifted elsewhere. Daniel had finished his speech. The applause had come and gone. The murmurs had turned to conversation again, and the band had just begun to tune for the next set when it happened. My father had lifted his glass, reflexively, arrogantly, perhaps intending to offer some final retort, a salvaged toast, something to reclaim the moment he felt slipping from his hands. But the wine had barely touched his mouth when the words reached him. Not Daniel's, mine, the ones I hadn't said all night, the ones I had waited years to speak. I hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it. I simply stepped forward, slowly, heels crunching over the gravel just loud enough to hush the laughter. I stood near the center of the room, still in my wedding dress, but now with my formal jacket over it, metals sharp against the white fabric like proof etched in metal. I didn't need a microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him and said, "You taught me to keep my back straight. You said discipline was everything. That emotion was weakness. That soldiers don't flinch. And now here you are, spitting out your wine like a boy who's never been told the truth." That was when it happened. The release, the moment his body rejected what his mind couldn't yet process. He coughed slightly, dabbed at his lips, his expression twisting between confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear if he still knew how to feel it. My mother reached toward him instinctively, but he shrugged her off with the same cold shoulder I had known all my life. And I watched it unfold, not with glee, not with malice, but with the calm presence of a commanding officer witnessing the final phase of an operation that had gone exactly as planned. I turned back to the room. My voice steady, my pulse slow. All my life I wanted him to see me, I said. Not as a reflection of his disappointment. Not as a caricature. Just as a person. A daughter. A soldier. A woman. But he couldn't. Not because I wasn't worth seeing, but because he was too small to hold the full picture. I looked around the room then, not for applause, not for validation, but to meet the eyes of every woman who had been told she was too much or not enough. Every guest who had once swallowed truth to keep a table from cracking. This day is not about what he thinks of me. It never was. This day is about legacy, and legacies are not built by those who shout the loudest. They are built by those who endure. I paused. The breeze caught the edge of the tent, and the air moved softly again. I exhaled, finally, and I have endured. Not because of him. In spite of him, I left the center of the room without waiting for a response. I didn't look back at him. I didn't need to. Because I had already seen everything I ever needed to see in his face. In that involuntary spit. In that silence. In the twitch of his jaw as the room refused to follow his lead. And when I returned to Daniel, I felt the full weight of something I hadn't allowed myself to name until now. Not closure. That's too neat. Too sterile. What I felt was sovereignty. The kind of internal power that doesn't depend on anyone's permission. The kind that stays even when everyone else leaves. Daniel's hand found mine, warm, steady. No questions. Just presence. And I knew I had chosen correctly. Not just in him, but in myself. The rest of the reception unfolded like an exhale. The band played. People danced. My mother found me in the corner an hour later. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She touched my arm and said, "You stood taller than any man in this room." And that was the first time in my life I believed she saw me as someone more than an extension of him. I hugged her, briefly, softly, and then let her go. We left before the last guests. Not to flee, but to claim our own ending. Daniel and I walked out of that garden under a canopy of string lights and a sky full of quiet stars. And when we reached the car, I turned once, just once, to look back. The reception tent was glowing in the distance. I saw my father standing alone near the edge of the lawn, arms folded, staring into the place I had just stood. And I knew what haunted him. Not the loss of control, but the fact that the room hadn't waited for him to regain it. It had simply moved on. Without him. As we drove away, Daniel reached for my hand again. This time I gripped it back with force, not because I needed support, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my own decision, the steady, unmistakable truth that I had made it here, to this moment, without bending into someone else's idea of who I should be. The general in me had waited for this moment for decades. Not to win, but to stop fighting. And as the taillights cut through the dark country road, I whispered words no one else could hear. Words I didn't need anyone to echo. Mission complete. The next morning, the sky was almost cruel in how blue it was. The kind of sky that dares you to forget what happened the day before, as if clear weather could erase the imprint of years collapsed in a single night. I stood barefoot on the balcony of the small guest house we had rented for the night. Daniel still asleep in the room behind me, the scent of coffee wafting faintly from the kitchenette. Below, the gravel paths curved through rows of olive trees, their shadows thin and quiet like sentinels who'd seen too much to speak. Everything was still, except me. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the lip of the chipped mug in my hand, steam curling upward into the morning air. Not from weakness, but from restraint, because there were still battles that hadn't ended. Some don't end with applause. They end in silences filled with unfinished sentences, and in the strange heaviness of knowing that even after a clean break, the past sometimes limps along behind you, stubborn, breathless, but still alive. I wasn't surprised when I heard his car tires on the gravel. They didn't squeal, didn't rush. Just the slow crunch of someone who believes they still have the right to arrive without warning. I didn't move. I simply waited, like I had been trained to do. Not by him, not by the Navy, but by years of holding my ground while someone else assumed the world would adjust to their presence. He stepped out of the car. The same uniform he had worn at the wedding reception, now a bit wrinkled, the metals slightly askew, the lines around his eyes more visible in daylight. He held no flowers, no envelope, just his own posture, which had always said more than his words. He stood about 10 feet away from me. Didn't climb the stairs. Didn't ask permission. Just cleared his throat and said, "You embarrassed me." It was not an apology. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a man used to being the one who defines what the aftermath is supposed to look like. I didn't answer. I simply sipped my coffee, eyes fixed on the horizon. He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "That wasn't the place for a personal attack," he added. "Not in uniform. Not in front of civilians. Not at your wedding." And there it was again. The endless deflection, the inability to name what actually happened. I didn't call him out. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I said, "You're right. It should have happened years ago. But you kept pushing it to tomorrow." He blinked. Once, twice, then nodded slowly, perhaps realizing that he had walked into a conversation where he no longer held any rank. "I was hard on you," he admitted after a pause. "Too hard? But I was trying to shape you. You were always too sensitive, too defiant, too soft." I let the words float in the air. The same recycled lines, the same faulty definitions. I finished the coffee and set the mug down beside me on the balcony railing. "You called me fat and ugly at my own wedding, sir," I said evenly. "That's not hard. That's cruel." His mouth opened slightly, not to argue, but as if realizing for the first time what he had actually said out loud in front of hundreds of people. "I didn't mean it that way," he mumbled. "You've always misunderstood my humor." Humor. That word stung deeper than the insult itself. Because it told me that after everything, after the medals, the war rooms, the deployments, the years of silence, he still thought of me as a child too fragile to handle the intent behind his actions. And worse, that he still clung to the illusion that intent was more important than impact. I took a step forward, only one. Just enough for him to feel the shift. "You don't have to mean something for it to leave a scar," I said. "And you don't get to decide when the bleeding should stop." There was a long, terrible pause. He looked down at the ground, the way men do when they suddenly realize they can't retreat but don't know how to advance. And then, for the first time in my life, his voice cracked. "You were right," he said. "You've done things I never could. You command respect from men who don't flinch in combat. You've become everything I claim to want in a soldier. And yet, I couldn't say it yesterday. I couldn't say anything." I saw the tremble in his throat, the fatigue in his eyes. He wasn't just grappling with guilt, he was confronting irrelevance. That slow death worse than any battlefield wound, to realize your power no longer dictates the room. "I don't need an apology," I said finally. "That would be for you, not for me." His eyes widened slightly. Not with offense, with confusion. Because for a man like him, apology had always been transactional. A key to regain access. But I wasn't offering re-entry. I was offering acknowledgement. "Nothing more. I didn't come to make peace," he admitted. "I came to—" He stopped, then tried again. "I came to see if there was anything left to salvage." And that was when I knew the conversation was over. I turned fully then. Straightened my back, stepped off the balcony stairs and stood at attention. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands behind my back, eyes leveled not at him but slightly above, as if addressing a memory. And slowly, precisely, I raised my right hand in a formal salute, not out of respect, but as closure, as a final act of decorum toward a man who had spent his life demanding discipline but never learned how to give love. He didn't return it. He couldn't. His arm faltered halfway up, then dropped uselessly to his side. His lips parted, but no words came. Because there was nothing left to say, and I didn't need him to. I stepped back onto the porch, picked up the mug again, and with it, all the weight I had once given to his approval. Then I turned my back and walked into the house. Daniel didn't ask questions. He just looked at me and nodded, like he had already known this day would come and trusted I would handle it with the precision I had honed over years of surviving a war that had never been declared, but had always been real. By noon, we were packed. By evening, we were on a flight to Japan, our true honeymoon, long delayed by deployments and logistics, but now finally real. Somewhere over the Pacific, as the cabin lights dimmed and the sound of the engines became a steady hum, I pulled out a small notebook from my bag. On the first page, I wrote, in capital letters, "I am done marching for ghosts," and beneath that, in softer script, "Let the next war be only the one I choose to fight." The plane touched down softly in Tokyo just past midnight, the city below blinking like a living map, its veins lit with neon and quiet motion. I hadn't been back in Japan since the bilateral training operation 4 years ago, when I was still second in command, still catching bullets with my spine for a man who couldn't see the difference between fear and loyalty. This time was different. No boots, no ranks, no rehearsed salute or steel posture. I stepped off the plane not as someone's daughter or subordinate, but as myself, a woman who had stood beneath a collapsing roof of expectations, let it fall, and still walked out upright. Daniel reached for my hand, and I let him hold it. Not because I needed the support, but because I no longer felt the urge to prove that I didn't. The days that followed were almost suspiciously soft. We moved through the city like water moves through stone, not forcing anything, just letting the new routine carve us gently. Mornings in a small corner cafe where the owner wore military pins on his apron and never asked questions. Afternoons exploring neighborhoods we didn't know how to pronounce, laughing when we got lost and didn't care. Evenings curled beneath blankets on tatami mats, listening to the rain tap against the paper-thin windows, like a lullaby from another life. And in those silences, something began to settle inside me. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, but clarity. The realization that I had spent 3 decades chasing a silhouette cast by someone else's authority, trying to match its shape instead of letting the sun hit me directly. I thought about my father less than I expected. When I did, it wasn't in anger anymore. It was like remembering a country I had once lived in. Familiar, yes, but no longer home. I knew what he'd say if he saw me now. No uniform, no formal posture, laughing too loud in public, letting my hair curl without pressing it into submission. He'd say I was letting myself go. I'd answer that I was finally letting myself be. And that difference, quiet as it seemed, was everything. One afternoon, we took a train out to a coastal village Daniel had read about. The air smelled of brine and memory. The local shrine had a weathered plaque that read, "Even the smallest light casts shadows." I stood in front of it longer than I should have, something in the words clinging to my chest. Because for so long, I had believed that only giants left shadows. Only great men with medals and booming voices could command space. I had forgotten that I too cast a shadow, not because I was big or loud or feared, but because I existed. Because I moved through this world with intent, and that was enough. Back home, months passed. Promotions came, interviews, panels asking me about resilience and grace under fire, as if those words were something to be curated for cameras instead of excavated from scar tissue. My photo went up on the wall of a naval institution back in D.C., the first woman in that division to hold the position. He must have seen it. Or maybe someone showed it to him. I don't know. I never asked. Because I didn't need him to know anymore. I didn't need his approval pressed into the margins of my accomplishments. My rank was no longer a silent petition for his recognition. It was simply mine. One evening, I received a letter, handwritten. The envelope sealed in the military style he had always used, crisp folds and deliberate corners. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It was a single page. It didn't say "I'm sorry." It didn't say "I love you." It said, "I didn't know how to raise a daughter who would outgrow me." I read it once. Then again. Then I put it back in the envelope and placed it in a drawer, beside old medals, folded flags, and the commendation letter I never hung on my wall. Not because it didn't mean anything, but because it wasn't the thing that saved me. I was the thing that saved me. That night, I walked out into the backyard barefoot, the grass cool and damp under my feet. I looked up at the sky, dark and wild and full of stars that didn't need names to shine. And I thought about that girl in the mirror years ago, the one who used to practice her salute, hoping it would somehow unlock her father's pride. I wished I could hold her, tell her she didn't need to be perfect or pretty or pleasing, that her worth wasn't waiting in someone else's eyes, that the war she thought she had to win was never hers to fight. In time, I started speaking to younger recruits, not about combat or tactics, but about the quieter battles, the ones that happen in the space between who you are and who the world expects you to be. I told them that strength isn't the absence of pain. It's knowing you can feel everything and still move forward. That dignity isn't something granted by rank or reputation, but something you wear under your skin. That sometimes the hardest battlefield is your own living room. At one of those talks, a young woman raised her hand. She looked barely 20. Sharp eyes, steady voice. She asked me, "How do you heal from someone who never apologized?" I paused. The room was still. And then I answered, "You stop expecting the apology. You give yourself permission to rise anyway. And then one day you look around and realize, you're already free." She nodded. Wrote it down. Maybe she needed it. Maybe one day she'll rewrite her own war story too. Daniel and I eventually moved again. Not out of necessity. Just to begin again. On our own terms. A smaller house. Fewer walls. More windows. My medals stayed in a drawer. But my boots? I kept those by the door. Not as a reminder of who I had to be, but of who I chose to become. I no longer march in anyone's shadow. I walk in my own light now, and it's enough, more than enough.